Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Elise Racine and I am a research associate with the Path for Europe, or PfEU. Thank you for joining us today for our conversation with Professor Mark Dawson on EU law and the COVID-19 crisis. Before we dive in, I want to quickly share a little more information about the think tank and our speaker. PfEU is an open and independent nonprofit think tank that was founded at the beginning of 2020 with the purpose of exploring different ways forward for the European Union. Our team is exclusively comprised of young researchers, PhD students, master students, and young professionals. We conduct research, develop policy advice, and strive to foster engagement with the European project through debates and talks, such as this one today. Today's talk is the final discussion in our 6-part Coffee Conversations COVID-19 webinar series, in which we have explored the impact of the pandemic on a variety of EU policy areas. We have the pleasure of being joined by Mark Dawson, Professor of European Law and Governance at the Hertie School. His research focuses on the relationship between law and policymaking in the EU, particularly in the fields of economic governance and human rights protection. Professor Dawson was previously an assistant professor at Maastricht University and has held visiting positions at the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE, the University of Wisconsin, and the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Dawson holds degrees from the Universities of Edinburgh and Aberdeen, as well as a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, where he was a 2019 Fernand Braudel Fellow. He is currently a member of the editorial board of the European Law Review and the principal investigator of Leviathan, a research project exploring the legal and political accountability structure of EU economic governance. Hello, Professor Dawson. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. To start off, I want to address a very recent development within the space of European law and economic governance. Earlier this week, there was a major judgment passed by the German Constitutional Court on the European Central Bank's original quantitative easing program. I thought we could unpack this, beginning with your opinion of the ruling and what you think it means not only for the ECB's COVID-19 response, such as the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, but the institution's independence and programs moving forward.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So I think when we first discussed doing this chat, we didn't know that the timing would be so good because this big judgment just happened on Tuesday. And it's a major judgment for reasons that I'll discuss in a moment. But it's also a bit unexpected, right? So actually, initially, this judgment was meant to be issued a couple of months ago. But then the COVID-19 crisis happened. And I think for quite wise reasons, the German Constitutional Court decided to delay its ruling because the meat of the judgment, the important policy implication is that the judgment is about the quantitative easing programs of the European Central Bank. So the programs whereby the European Central Bank tries to inject liquidity and money into the Eurozone economy by buying bonds. And around that time when COVID-19 started, the ECB issued a new program to try and fight the economic crisis that is induced by COVID-19. And of course, the danger was that if the German Constitutional Court had issued its opinion back then, this would have been caused even more panic than it already is causing, having issued its judgment this week. So what is important about that judgment? Why is it considered such a landmark ruling? Actually, we were talking a little bit earlier about Twitter. If you look on Twitter, every European lawyer has something to say. A lot of European lawyers are very concerned and outraged by the judgment. I'm a bit less concerned for reasons I'll explain. But one of the reasons why it's such a landmark judgment, or maybe there are a couple of reasons. One reason is that a lot of people have described the German Constitutional Court as the dog that's often barking, but it's never biting. So it's often said in the past that it thinks that European integration is going too far in certain areas, that it might not be consistent with the German constitution. It's also said this actually in relation to certain activities of the ECB in the past, but it's very rarely actually acted, right? It's very rarely tried to disapply an EU program on the grounds that the EU's gone beyond its powers. So this is really the first time that it's done this, that it's sort of exercised this competence to rule that a program of the EU is beyond the EU's powers. Actually, it's not the first constitutional court in Europe to do this. So the Czech Constitutional Court has done this. We have some other examples, but never an example from such a powerful constitutional court. So I think this is kind of one of the issues. You know, what kind of precedent is this setting? Is this undermining European law? And could it lead other courts, other constitutional courts? And here I think the concern is particularly think about the Polish or Hungarian courts. Could they use this as a reason to depart from EU law, to undermine EU law, to opt out of different EU programs? So I think this is kind of the one issue about the judgment. The second issue about the judgment, of course, is about its policy impacts. So the policy impact on the program the German court was actually assessing is not that significant, because as is normal with a legal case, actually the program they're assessing is no longer in effect. So they're assessing an older quantitative easing program, which is no longer in place. But of course, by saying that that program was illegal, they're also obviously commenting on whether the current and the new program is legal. So they explicitly say in their judgment that they're not doing this, that they're not commenting on the legality of the new COVID-19 program. But of course, a number of the reservations they have about the old program, so reservations about its size, reservations about whether this could infringe on the economic policy competences of the member states, all of those concerns, they apply to the new COVID-19 program as well. So that's kind of the second reason why this is kind of an important judgment, because one, people fear, well, the consequence might be that the new COVID-19 program might be challenged and might be ruled illegal. And of course, that would have a big economic effect. Maybe, so I don't talk too long, let me finish by saying, do I think this is a real risk, right? So thinking about both of those issues, the issue of, well, does this undermine European law in some structural way? Is that a problem? And second of all, does it undermine the activity of the ECB and the independence of the ECB? Is that a problem? I am actually one of the people that's a little bit less freaked out by this ruling. I don't think it's quite as damaging as many commentators say. So why is that? The first of these issues is, I think the German Constitutional Court makes it very clear that this is an exceptional ruling, right? That it doesn't intend to now change its standard of review to change the way it approaches other EU programs. But it has consistently said in the past that it has problems with relation to this particular program because of the exceptional size and nature of the ECB's quantitative easing program. If you also look at the details of the judgments, the German Constitutional Court has problems with particular things. So one of the things it doesn't like is it says that the European Court of Justice and the ECB, they didn't properly consider the proportionality of this program. So they didn't consider whether the program could be smaller, what kind of distributive effects would it have, so how would it impact on the poor or on savers or on pensioners. So in a way, what it's saying is it's not that this program is per se illegal and will always be illegal, and all forms of quantitative easing are beyond the powers of the European Union. Instead, it's saying to the ECB and to the Court of Justice of the EU, you have to do a better job of convincing me that you've taken the economic impacts properly into account, that you've actually weighed the different interests that are involved in making this particular decision. And I think that also applies in relation to the concern that we see for whether Hungary or Poland or other countries could utilize this judgment to undermine EU law. I think we have to be able to distinguish here. We have to be able to distinguish between a national court like the German Constitutional Court that is in general open to European integration, but might question European integration on occasion and based on solid constitutional reasons, versus governments that actively undermine the rule of law or have no interest in good faith improving the European constitutional settlement. So I'm not so convinced that this is as much of a blow to the overall legal structure as it might look. But I'm also not so convinced that it's a blow to the ECB's independence and the future programs of the ECB as much as it might look. So essentially the effect of the ruling, and the German Constitutional Court made this clear, is it gives the European Central Bank 3 months to respond. So the main issue, as I said before, was proportionality. So was this a proportional program? Could it have been more limited? Should it have taken different forms of evidence on board? Essentially, the German Constitutional Court is saying to the ECB, give us evidence that you've done this. Please give us evidence that you're meaningfully assessing the distributive consequences, or that you're considering alternatives, or that you're managing quantitative easing in the right way. I think it's open and it's possible for the European Central Bank to do that, for the European Central Bank to address those concerns within a 3-month period, and still therefore to comply with this ruling. Of course, they could have done the opposite. They could have said, well, this program immediately loses its effects. Or they could have commented on the future COVID-19 program. They could have said, well, the standards applicable to this program are also binding in relation to the COVID-19 QE program. But they didn't do that either. So I think we have to keep that in mind. Of course, it was a landmark ruling. Many people said it was too aggressive. It infringes on the independence of the ECB too much. I think the German Constitutional Court was probably conscious of this, and that is why they gave this kind of time period for the ECB to comply. So I'm a little bit sort of less worried also in terms of its policy consequences than other people have been. But I could say a lot more because this is really my favorite topic, but maybe I leave it there for now. That's already a long answer.
I just want to clarify one point before we move on. You had published a work before this ruling that was talking about the ECB's pandemic emergency purchase program, where you kind of talked about how there were some conflicts between that program and the existing legal and political accountability structure of the Eurozone. Do you think this ruling could actually be a catalyst to rethink that structure and to kind of address some of those conflicts?
I very much hope so. Because I think that one of the difficulties, I mean, of course, the ECB is independent for particular reasons, right? And we know that that is to protect the stability of its mission, the credibility of its mission. But of course, it's also problematic from a democratic point of view because it means that the ECB cannot be rendered accountable in the way that other EU actors can be rendered accountable. And I think one of the ways it can be rendered accountable is through law and through courts, right? So courts can be the ones that act in order to scrutinize the activities the ECB is doing in the absence of other actors like parliaments or other political actors being able to act. And I think that is the case, that's what the German Constitutional Court is trying to do in this judgment. Now, you can criticize it for various reasons, that it's being too unilateral, that it should coordinate its approach with other states. They're all valid objections. But I think it could prompt a rethink on certain things. So let me just give one example. One thing that I think is problematic is the mandate of the European Central Bank. So if you look at the mandate of the bank is only about price stability. So the idea is, well, the ECB only deals with inflation and interest rates and prices. The rest is for the national governments to deal with. But we know from empirical evidence, if you talk to economists, that monetary policy and fiscal policy are heavily interlinked, right? So if you have an economic catastrophe like we're having at the moment, of course that has a huge impact on price stability. Of course it has a huge impact on prices. As it is though, the ECB in theory cannot do anything about that, right? So that it can only act to defend its price stability mandate. It can't act to defend the general economic integrity of the Eurozone, even though these two things are actually interdependent and they're linked to one another. So I think one of the things that we should obviously look again at is widening the mandate of the ECB. So the Federal Reserve in the US already has a dual mandate. It's about, the Federal Reserve is not just there to ensure stable prices, but also unemployment, low levels of unemployment. So I think changing that in relation to the ECB, giving it a wider mandate, that would more accurately reflect actually the role of this institution. And maybe this ruling could be one prompt to think again at that issue.
Wonderful, that's so interesting. I wanted to address another topic that came up in your answer, and that is the rule of law, especially in the context of Hungary, which you mentioned. So Prime Minister Viktor Orban has used the COVID-19 crisis as a pretext to execute an unprecedented power grab that allows him to rule by decree. I was hoping you could elaborate a bit more on how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting the rule of law in member states, in particular Hungary, if you could explain kind of that development, and with that, how the EU could react and should react.
Sure. So I think you have, maybe there are two issues here. One is the rule of law in this kind of really fundamental sense that we see threatened in Hungary and Poland. But maybe another issue, which I can maybe touch on briefly, is EU law in general, right? So we have closed borders around Europe, right? We have severe restrictions on the normal rights that you enjoy as an EU citizen, which is to move, to enjoy citizenship, to not be discriminated against. And of course, I think the risk is that once states rebuild their borders and once states restrict EU law in this way on the basis of public health, there's a danger that those rules overstay their welcome, right? And there's an especial danger because, of course, there are potentially different levels of immunity between different European populations. And of course, that could be seen as a reason by some states to maintain borders indefinitely. So I think this is a real worry. And even if you look at sort of deeper issues in relation to the rule of law, and I'll come on to Hungary and Poland in a moment, one of the issues is that some states have declared different forms of states of emergency. And the question is whether, again, that is a power that could be abused. And it's not just Hungary and Poland. So France has basically been in various forms of martial law and states of emergency since the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which were many, many, many years ago now. We have other states, for example, Latvia, Romania, that are derogating from the European Convention on Human Rights. They say that's necessary in order to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. So if we were just to if we were just a Martian who landed on Earth and had no idea about COVID-19, we'd think that there was a very drastic authoritarian turn, not just in Poland and Hungary, but across Europe, because actually fundamental rights, human rights considerations, they're obviously not really foremost in people's minds. And the danger, of course, is that once you have limitations, that they become permanent at some point. I think, of course, with Hungary and Poland, that's a particular risk. With Poland, many of you will have seen that one of the issues here was the Polish presidential election that is now being postponed, which is maybe a hopeful sign that some of the external critique of the decision of the Polish government to hold its presidential election in spite of the danger that there'd be mass disenfranchisement, that was taken seriously, and that eventually sort of got through to the domestic government. In Hungary, though, we have a different situation. In Poland, we still have relatively functioning domestic institutions. We have strong grassroots and civil society movements. We still have some semblance of independent media. In Hungary, we've had a semi-authoritarian government going into authoritarian for a decade now. And of course, it's had a longer term effects on institutions. And of course, one of the effects was that when Orban suggested this emergency law, there was nothing like the level of resistance that you would have expected in other EU member states. And I think that law is genuinely worrying, right? Sort of it essentially collapses the distinction between the different branches of government and places all of the relevant powers in the hands of the executive. And it also doesn't really have a clear end point, right? It's not clear how this emergency can be declared over. It's not clear how this is not essentially a decision solely in the hands of the Prime Minister. And under one of the other concerning aspects, of course, is that what happens if certain rules are enacted by decree? How can they be voided or reviewed later on, right? Again, that's difficult because the way in which the emergency law has been enacted, this is a point made by Kimberlin Shepard, who some of you will have read from Princeton. It's often will require supermajority in parliament to override the laws that are enacted through decree by the Orban government in this period. So I think that there is a danger that there's all sorts of things enacted in legislation that might be prejudicial to human rights, independent institutions, to non-Hungarians, that will be very difficult to roll back later on. So there is a genuine worry there. Last, of course, what can the EU do about it? Unfortunately, as you all know, the EU's record in confronting the Hungarian government is not a good one. Partly that's to do with the available tools. So the main tool that we have, which is Article 7 of the treaty, requires unanimity. which has been a very difficult hurdle to achieve and certainly will not be achieved while we have 2 problem cases in the European Council. But I think it's not just a question of the available tools, it's also a question of political will, right? So we had Orban and the Fidesz party in the European People's Party, the main centre-right grouping of the European Parliament, for years and years and years and years before their membership was finally suspended. We also know that there's a proposal to link for so-called rule of law conditionality for EU funding for things like cohesion and structural funding. Again, that's been held up in the Council on the basis that not just Hungary and Poland, but also other governments are reluctant to pass this legislation. So there isn't yet, it seems, the political will to really do something serious about this. This is a step change. I think sort of the emergency law is by far, in my view, the most serious rule of law violation that Orban government has conducted to date. So if anything might sort of focus people's attentions, maybe it will be this, particularly if the emergency sort of continues, even after the number of COVID infections in Hungary rapidly declines, as it already has actually. So hopefully, again, a little bit like the German Constitutional Courts, maybe something good that might come out of this is sort of stiffening the backbones of the other member states to act, and which is of course something that if you speak to Hungarian citizens, people who are in institutions like the CEU, they've been asking for this kind of solidarity from other European governments for a long time, and it just hasn't always been forthcoming.
On that note, I know there has been a little bit more of a recent conversation around potentially expelling Orban's Fidesz party from the EPP. Do you think that's at all a viable option, or is that a dangerous path to go down? I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
No, I think that's entirely viable. I think it's for political parties to decide upon their membership, and I think the scope for that is increased because before, in the last parliament elections, the EPP and the Socialist group, they had a bare majority, right, between them to pass legislation. Of course, the risk was that if then Fidesz left the EPP, that would endanger that majority. But ironically, because the new parliament is even more fragmented, anyway, these 2 parties don't have a majority. And even without Fidesz, the EPP needs, at least 2 other of the major groupings in order to pass legislation. So I think now is the time to act. There are still kind of important friends of Fidesz within this country, and within the CSU, for example, that have often acted to defend Fidesz's place within the EPP. But I think sort of the patience with the Hungarian government from certainly within Germany and also within other member states is wearing thin. So I think that's likely to happen. I mean, of course, the question might be sort of what impact does that actually have? I mean, maybe not a major impact, but it's, from a symbolic point of view, it's nonetheless, I think, important.
Wonderful. And I want to quickly return to something you said at the very beginning when we started talking about this topic. And you mentioned, it's not just Hungary and Poland, and that there are some other human rights challenges that the EU is currently facing. And in particular, you're talking about border restrictions. Do you think this pandemic has the chance to amplify some of those challenges, particularly as they relate to the rights of minorities and refugees and asylum seekers?
No, I mean, I think we know that sort of when there are major economic and social crises, they have certain distributive effects, and the people who tend to lose are people who have, for example, poor political representation, right, or people who are not part of the mainstream media conversation, right? So think about, for example, the refugee crisis when it first arose. There were many human rights violations that happened during that period, but I think there were also a lot less human rights violations than perhaps there might have been, just because there was like a lot of scrutiny as well, right? There was a strong media presence. There were also political groups within this country and across Europe mobilizing on the other side in favor of refugee rights. And I think sort of that attention has been lost, right? So COVID-19 just so dominates our conversation that sort of we're not really focusing on this problem anymore. But also sort of the attention of those who support and stand up for refugees has also potentially been diverted to other issues. So think about the Greens in this country. They have an important point to make about how the outbreak has to do with the way we treat animals and the environment, and that's a way of conceptualizing the problems that we're now in. So I think sort of because the conversation has shifted, there is a certain danger there. And of course, we know that COVID-19 poses very specific problems for refugees. So think about refugee camps, for example. These are really hotbeds for the spread of infection. Think also about states that have states of emergency that restrict movement, that restrict access, that divert basic resources to hospitals and other places. Potentially resources are being diverted away from asylum seekers. So this is kind of a key issue, but what's key is also that we sort of focus attention on that we send a clear message that we still care and we're still thinking about it, because I think that's one of the main risks.
Thank you for that. And then the last topic I wanted to kind of talk about before we dive into questions from the audience was I think another really fascinating component to this entire conversation around the EU's pandemic response is the competencies that the EU even has to fight this crisis. And that includes in the field of health, but also overall. I was wondering if you could expand on these, and with that in mind, how can the EU from a legal perspective better prepare for your future pandemics and other cross-border health threats?
Sure. So, I mean, if you look at the legal framework, the powers that the EU has in this field are very limited. So it's really an area of kind of national competence. And I think there are also good reasons for that. So one of the interesting discussions that I find in legal literature is they talk about federal versus non-federal systems and who has done better at fighting the pandemic. So is it better in non-federal settings? Because then you have a kind of consistency of treatment, you can centralize resources. So a classical example would be perhaps France or the UK, where sort of everything comes from the top down. Or are you better living in a federal system whereby you have different strategies in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern versus Baden-Württemberg, and you have a approach that's more coordinated depending on the circumstances in different regions? We don't have a definitive answer to that, but certainly my own feeling is that German federalism hasn't been a hindrance to the ability of Germany to respond to the pandemic. And actually sometimes it's been an advantage because it's allowed different states to experiment with different approaches. It's allowed the easing of the lockdown to reflect the conditions within particular regions. And of course that logic also can be transposed onto the European level. So you could say, well, what we don't need is some kind of highly centralized European response. Probably that wouldn't be particularly effective in dealing with a crisis like this. But what we do need is very strong coordination, right? And that does seem to be lacking at the moment. So as I said before, borders all of a sudden really matter, right? So think about people who live in border regions, like in the Swiss border, the French border in this country, and other border regions, who go across the border also as part of their livelihood to work, to get basic products because they have family ties in other countries within the EU. All of a sudden, the fact that there's a national border matters in a way that didn't matter before. And the same logic, which is the logic that, well, different regions have to respond differently, that also suggests that maybe borders shouldn't matter to us under certain circumstances, right? So if there's a region like the region around Maastricht where I used to work that's borders Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany, maybe that region requires a particular approach. And the way in which the EU system is working is kind of hindering the ability of those regions to do that. Finally, I think the economic impact of the crisis, that's an area where the EU could do a lot more. So why is the ECB acting the way it is? Why is it announcing these vast programs? One of the reasons is because it sees that the member states, they're limited in their abilities to act. So we had a big discussion that many of you followed over Corona bonds, a big fight basically between Germany, the Netherlands, and a few others versus the rest of the European Union. What we ended up with is a classic fudge whereby there was some financial assistance, but not corona bonds, so not mutualization of debts. And it's because we don't have radical solutions in terms of the ability of member states to pursue a joint fiscal policy or joint economic policies. That's why the ECB has to act in this way, and as a result, get itself into all of these sort of legal difficulties. So I think sort of more could be done in terms of coordination, more could be done on the fiscal and economic sides, but on the core public health activities, they have to remain, I guess, at the national level.
Just quickly following up on that, do you think then that the virus can actually lead to changes in the legal order on a more permanent basis in some of these areas?
I think so. I mean, I think probably in the specific instance I've mentioned before, like the way we see the ECB, the way we coordinate public health crises. The fear, of course, is that the permanent changes are negative changes, like the state of emergency, like the reintroduction of borders. So, I mean, I'd be very concerned if one of the consequences of this crisis was a revisiting, for example, the Schengen rules, right? Schengen rules already allow certain exceptions in the case of public health emergencies, but there might be a pressure, of course, to weaken those rules even more. That could be a consequence. So we shouldn't assume that sort of there'll be a positive ending. There might also be pressure to sort of renationalize certain things as a result of this.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Professor Dawson, for answering my questions and shedding some light on the implications of the pandemic for European law and economic governance. I want to turn to the questions from our audience. We have a couple questions already. We'll try to answer as many as possible. And if you do have a question, please include it in the Q&A tab so that we can see it. I'm just gonna go down the list here. So starting off, do you think the ECB will be responsive to the German Constitutional Court, or rather say that they are not accountable to the German court?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Damian. So I think one interesting thing is that when the litigation actually happened in Karlsruhe, the ECB could have made submissions. They were invited to do so, but they refused to do so. And one of the reasons is because, of course, they don't recognize that their legal counterpart is the German Constitutional Court. As far as they're concerned, their counterpart is the European Court of Justice because they're an EU institution. Now, of course, they could follow that route. They could say, well, we're not going to respond to this ruling. Actually, if you look at the press release the ECB just released, they say they take note of the judgments, which is kind of a legal way of saying, leave us alone. But I think that would be a bit foolhardy. We know that sort of German participation in this program is essential for its functioning. That's even more the case with the new COVID-19 program. So I would expect something like the ECB legal service writing a document about the proportionality of the ECB's activities in the area of QE that pretends that it's not about the German Constitutional Court reading. It probably will not even directly refer to that reading. But of course, de facto, it would be a kind of response. And it could also be a way of the German court also saving face by saying, well, look, the European Central Bank has acted and therefore it's complied with our judgment. So, I mean, if I had a little kind of fly in the legal service of the ECB right now, I'm guessing that they're working furiously on producing a document of this kind.
Okay. And then next up, doesn't it lead to a stronger Eurosceptic group in the EU if the EPP expels Fidesz from its ranks?
Yes. This, of course, is the risk. There's a very crude British saying that we use for this, which is, I'd rather have someone on the inside of the tent peeing out than on the outside of the tent peeing in. I never quite understood that saying. I think in the case of Fidesz, within the Eurosceptic grouping, they're not a very powerful actor, right? I mean, it's pretty clear. I mean, a little bit, not quite as strongly as on the German level, but there's kind of a cordon sanitaire around those groups. They don't have much influence on EU legislation. I think that would also be the case if Fidesz joined. I mean, Hungary ultimately is not a large member state. Fidesz has a majority of the Hungarian MEPs, but it's not going to make such a difference. I think a greater danger is that they're within the EPP, which is a group that does have a major influence on EU policy making, and they influence it from the inside, or they encourage the EPP to be lax on certain things where it should be active, like on human rights issues or fundamental rights issues. So I'm for a tougher approach, broadly speaking.
Okay, thank you. Next up, do you think we will see a sanction for rule of law infringements one day?
I'm in it one day, sure. When that day is going to come, I don't know. I think one of the difficulties, I have colleagues in different countries across Europe. We often meet in legal conferences and so on. And if I talk to my colleagues who are involved in legal academia or legal practice, let's say in Slovakia or Slovenia, or they're also like Malta, for example, they also don't have complete confidence in terms of the state of the rule of law in those states, right? So essentially, in order for Article 7 to be applied, we have to be back to a situation where we have really one problem state, right? And all the rest agree that they're going to act. I think it's pretty unlikely that we're going to be in that position in the near future. We have more populism. It's not just in Central and Eastern Europe, it's also in the West. So I'm not so sure whether that will happen. I think other measures, so the measure I mentioned before about linking funding to rule of law, that could pass. I think if that passed, it would be used very actively. I think that is a potential fruitful way forward. But the real big bazooka, the Article 7, I don't see that happening soon.
Okay. And some German officials are thinking about holding elections next year remotely with sending in letters. Do you think that this would infringe constitutional law? How can we hold elections during pandemics? I think that's a fascinating question. I'm American, so this is also something that's very timely for us as well.
Yes, I'm wondering why there are not more people talking about this, actually. There are not more people talking about the prospect that the American presidential election won't go ahead, whether it'll be severely distorted, right? I think that's a huge risk that deserves more attention. I think Germany benefits from, incidentally, I'm not a German constitutional law scholar per se. I will, though, advertise one event. So some of you, if you're really interested in legal issues, there's a very well-known blog called Verfassungsblog, which comments on German constitutional law. And they're actually having a series of events on COVID-19 crisis. And one of the panels is about German constitutional law and COVID-19. So there you would get much better answers to this than I would. But one of the advantages Germany has is it has a very strong and respected constitutional court. A constitutional court that's capable of acting fast if it needs to act fast. And I think, if there are regulations of the next German federal election, for example, a move to mail-in voting only, to some form of online voting, to a mixed system, I would feel confident in the sense that there is a legal institution who would take that seriously and potentially would review whether that might result in certain parts of the population being disenfranchised, or it might result in a manipulation of the electoral results. So I'm more worried. This is more a question for Elise, but I'd be more worried about the United States, which is more partisanly divided, where the Supreme Court also has a partisan divide, than I would be about Germany. But maybe, Elise, maybe you're more optimistic than I am.
We'll see. I think it's going to be really fascinating. And it is not just an issue that's facing Germany and the United States. I think it's depending on what the new normal looks like for pandemics or post-pandemic. I think this might be a question that comes up more and more in other countries as well. Thank you for the recommendation for people who are interested in this topic, where they can get more information on this. Moving on to the next question. There is a growing concern that COVID-19 is fueling nationalism, including legal and economic nationalism. We have seen this in some of the member states' initial responses to the pandemic. Could you speak further on these developments and what they mean for the future of both the monetary union specifically and the EU more generally? How can we combat these sentiments? I think that's a very important question to be asking right now.
Yes. It is a very important question. I think you're absolutely right. There is this risk. There's also a great deal of kind of stereotyping and racial discrimination that we see emerging. We see things like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories emerging surrounding COVID-19. This risk is very real. I'm a bit sort of less pessimistic than others about that. So one thing, of course, is that think about some of the major states like France, Germany, Italy, and often actually the incumbent governments. So governments that are relatively Europhile in their profile. Certainly in the case of the French government, it's rather Europhile. They've been pretty politically rather kind of reinforced by the crisis. So there's been kind of this being a rallying around the flag that actually indirectly benefits politicians that are, pro-European in orientation. So I find it relatively encouraging that you think about the Italian case. I think the initial fear was that Salvini would make hay out of this crisis, that it would benefit him politically. That could still happen, but we don't see very strong evidence of that. I think sort of how do we combat that? I think the way we combat that is by doing, I suppose, doing the kind of things that you are doing in your own in this organization, right? Which is raising awareness, trying to be active and engaged on a European level, trying to inform people about the commonality of the challenges that we face. COVID-19 is a classical case of high levels of interdependence between states. It's also an example whereby the authority of science has a little bit been resurrected after an era. I'm from the country where one of our leading politicians said that the public had had enough of experts, and as a result, they shouldn't listen to them. I think that sort of rhetoric has been exposed for kind of the lie that it was. So I think there are some positive signs, and it's just then for citizens and for politicians to sort of make the most out of what we have, and to make sure that the better things that we had going into this crisis, like having an area of free movement, for example, that they can be properly restored once lockdown measures start to be eased.
Okay. I want to be conscientious of your time. We have 3 more questions. Do you have time to answer them? Otherwise, we can also wrap up if not.
I do, but some of them maybe are linked, right?
Yeah, you can go through them. Yeah, you can see them as well. The first one is interesting. Professor Dawson, you talk about a need for coordination in the current pandemic context. What do you think about the German opposition to economic coordination? It seems that the ruling of the German court goes along with the German government's opposition to corona bonds. And I'll actually just quickly add to that because this is something I'm curious about. And we were just talking about nationalism. We had a speaker yesterday who talked about a recent Italian poll where I think it was there about 50% listed China as a friendly country, and another like 45 listed Germany as an enemy. And I know the corona bonds have been a very contentious issue. Do you think that the constitutional ruling is, and the Germans' opposition to the corona bonds, all of that has the potential to also intensify some of these sentiments between countries as well? So just the question that Daisy asked as well is kind of adding that caveat onto it. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, they're very good questions. So, I mean, maybe starting with the second one first. I mean, of course, one of the danger is that there's a perception that that's the case, that sort of, for example, that the German constitutional system restricts the ability of Germany to create corona bonds or to engage in an EU program on corona bonds. But the reality actually isn't the case, right? So as I mentioned before, there are restrictions in German constitutional law that I think restricts what the ECB is doing, but I don't think they really apply in the same way to corona bonds. There is actually an interesting post on Fason's blog by a guy called Matthias Goldman, a professor at VU Law 2, who goes into that in more detail than I could. But more broadly, I don't maybe linking a little bit to sort of this new question as well. The German Constitutional Court made an interesting distinction in its ruling. So there are two different ways where the German Constitutional Court exercises review. One of them is so-called ultra vires review, which is where it says this is beyond the EU's powers and therefore we won't accept it. The other form is more controversial, is so-called identity review. An identity review is where they say, well, this is something that's so close to German identity that it can't be handled at the European level. And of course, the difficulty with that identity review category is it says, well, there are some policy questions that are simply always have to remain at the national level, and these are somehow fixed, so they're not dynamic. Now, when the German Constitutional Court issued its ruling the other day and talked about QE, it only said that QE was ultra vires. It didn't say that it was contrary to German constitutional identity. And in my view, that's actually quite an important distinction, because it leaves the door open for the German Constitutional Court to allow for greater EU action on fiscal policy, on creating mutualization of debts, on acting in other ways in the fiscal fields. Whereas if they'd said, well, that QE was incompatible with the identity review test, it would have been much more restrictive, right? So maybe that's kind of quickly my answer to that. Should I quickly go through the others?
Yeah, if you have time, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. In terms of the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, so that's then the Corona program, is it compatible with existing EU law? I think it's not compatible with the German Constitutional Court's judgment, right? So one of the things that the German Constitutional Court had concerns about actually was that the new Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program seems to be tailored for particular states. So if we look at the bonds that have currently been bought, it seems that they've mostly been bought in the states that were most affected, as a result suffered the most, like Italy and Spain. If you look at some of the things that the German Constitutional Court says about the previous QE program, it seems that it would think that would be incompatible with European law. So I think from a European law perspective, it's probably okay. So we don't have time to talk about the Court of Justice that much, but there are reasons why the Court of Justice might think that PEP is okay. The problem comes from the national level. So I think probably there are some changes that might be needed there. Changing the ECB's mandate. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I mean, so I'm in favor of changing the mandate because I think that would be a more honest reflection of what the ECB does. But that doesn't mean that I'm not in favor also of other changes. So I think that the ECB should be a more accountable institution in general, right? So one of the things that I suggested in that article that Elise mentions was that I think that when the ECB acts in particular areas, so when it enacts programs of a particular volume, for example, that national parliament should be able to assess that in a way that they're not permitted to do so at the moment. So I think if indeed we just changed the mandate and didn't change anything else, there would be this danger that you mentioned. But I think sort of a change of the mandate should go hand in hand with a general rethinking of the ECB's activity. So this is, I think, how I would approach that. Is the German central bank responsive to German institutions? That's an interesting question. So from what we hear, the German central bank actually was okay with the PEP program. That might have been to do with the urgency, that sort of everything was collapsing at that point. They felt they had to go along with it. Historically, the Bundesbank has been very critical of quantitative easing. So that might suggest that sort of if the PEP program develops in a certain direction, for example, it continues to buy mostly the bonds of southern member states and not rather than basing its bonds on objective criteria, the Bundesbank might start having objections. So we have to see. But one of the difficulties, of course, is that the minutes of the meetings of the ECB are intransparent, right? So we don't actually know all the time what the positions of the different central banks are. So that's another accountability problem to add to some of the others that I mentioned before.
Lots of great foods for thought here. So that's the end of our questions and the end of our WebTalk. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Dawson. This was fascinating. And thank you to our audience. We have thoroughly enjoyed hosting this webinar series. We've learned a lot in the process. We hope you have learned a lot in the process. If you missed any of the previous talks, 3 of them so far have been posted to our YouTube channel, and the rest will be up shortly, including this one, if there's any points you want to go back and review. And to keep up to date with our research and other events, make sure you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. You can always also contact us at contact@pathforeurope.eu. Thank you once again, especially Professor Dawson. And we hope that everyone stays healthy and safe during these difficult times.
Thank you for the brilliant questions. It was great.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.